Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They do not come screaming through the warp like daemons. They do not burn planets for vengeance or conquest. They do not negotiate, and they do not relent. The enslavers drift in silence, formless shadows of malevolence that prey not upon the body, but the soul. To them, life is not sacred, and death is not an end. They exist to consume, to dominate, to unravel the very meaning of personhood, until all that remains is a puppet strung to their will. There are tortures in the galaxy that shatter bone, rend flesh, and flay minds. But the enslavers craft a suffering deeper, more insidious. They peel back the psyche layer by layer, until even pain becomes incomprehensible. Their victims do not scream, they dissolve. This is not a story of battlefields or heroes. This is a descent into the cold, impersonal cruelty of a force that understands torment as an art and survival as a curse. To understand the torture wrought by the enslavers, one must begin not with the victims, but with the predators themselves. They are not demons in the traditional sense, nor are they constructs of malice born from mortal sin like the daemons of chaos. They are something older, colder, and more alien. In the depths of the warp, they emerged not from hatred or vengeance, but from hunger. A need to dominate psychic minds the way a black hole consumes light. Their cruelty is not chosen. It is the default consequence of their existence. To encounter them is to fall into a pattern of torment that is not directed at you personally, but nonetheless unmakes everything you are. The enslavers were first truly noticed during the time of the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones and the Necrontire waged a conflict so vast that the psychic backlash tore holes in reality. These rifts allowed entities from the immaterium to seep into the physical world. The enslavers were among the first, not malicious spirits, but parasitic forces drawn to psychic light like moths to flame. They latched onto the minds of the psychers, who had been so instrumental in the Old Ones' designs, and in doing so turned them into gateways. Through these hosts, the enslavers poured into real space, bringing with them the nightmare logic of the warp. Their method of invasion is itself a form of torture. The victim is not simply possessed. Their soul becomes a tunnel. The enslaver bores into the deepest recesses of their psyche, unspooling memories and feelings, searching not for resistance but resonance. They align with fear, amplify it, wear it like a mask. The more intense the emotional reaction, the stronger their grip. They do not just arrive through warp rifts. They bloom inside minds, corroding willpower and sense of self until there is nothing left but a writhing conduit. Once present, their domination is absolute. They ensnare not only individuals but entire populations through a cascading chain of psychic control. Every mind linked becomes another node in a growing network of pain. But this control is not clean. It is not surgical or swift. It is a slow, scraping, intimate process. The enslaver presses against every thought, every regret, every trauma in a person's mind. It does not seek to kill but to convert, and that conversion is agony. There is no known anatomy for the enslavers because they defy comprehension. Descriptions vary wildly, and this variance itself is telling. What the eye perceives is not what they are, but a distortion tailored to provoke horror and disorientation. Some see massive jellyfish-like creatures with undulating limbs and a single, gaping eye. Others see floating tumors of warped flesh and impossible geometry. The body is illusion, the mind is the true weapon, and it is within that battlefield that their tortures begin. Because they feed on psychic energy, the enslavers cannot simply kill. Death ends the flow. They require prolonged exposure, which means keeping victims alive, mentally and physically, for as long as possible. But survival under an enslaver is not life. It is a drawn-out annihilation of agency, emotion, and meaning. They extract pain not for fun, not out of sadism, but because it resonates with the psychic frequencies they consume. This pain, especially when rich with fear, confusion, and hopelessness, is a banquet. This is the root of their cruelty. It is not deliberate. It is ecological. Like a spider that must inject its prey with venom to dissolve it from within, the enslavers must dissolve the mind in order to draw sustenance. And just as the spider leaves a hollowed shell behind, so too do the enslavers leave their victims. Alive, often, but emptied. In many ways, this makes them more horrifying than the daemons of the ruinous powers. The daemons of Corn kill. The daemons of Slaanesh torment, yes, but their acts are tied to desire and ecstasy. The enslavers bypass such primitive motives. They enact suffering as a law of physics. Their torture is not baroque or flamboyant. It is subtle, relentless, and utterly alien. There is no malice to plead with, no desire to exploit, no wrath to outrun. There is only the process, and perhaps that is the final horror of it. In the enslaver's vision of the universe, individuality is a brief illusion, autonomy is sickness to be corrected. They do not hate you, they erase you. Slowly, efficiently, absolutely. The only thing that truly survives their attention is the echo of your agony, stretched thin across their psychic web like a final, fading scream. Pain is not always physical. For the enslavers, true suffering is born in the mind, in the way thoughts unravel, identities fracture, and willpower crumbles beneath the weight of invasion. Their primary tool of torture is psychic domination, but to call it domination does not do justice to the complexity of the horror. It is not a simple command, not a shout within the mind. It is a suffocating tide that floods every corner of consciousness, drowning out thought and replacing it with a single suffocating awareness. You are no longer your own. The initial contact is always subtle, a whisper, perhaps, at the edge of consciousness, a dream that doesn't end when you wake, a familiar memory that changes slightly each time you recall it. These are the first threads, and once they begin to weave, the mind becomes a tapestry of unraveling stability. The enslaver does not shout to take control. It insinuates. It co-opts your own voice, your own inner monologue, until you cannot tell whether a thought is yours or something whispered into your skull by something just beyond perception. Victims often describe this phase, when they still can describe things, as being haunted by themselves. Their memories echo back incorrectly. The voices of loved ones take on tones of mockery or menace. The past feels rewritten in real time. This mental destabilization is not just a precursor to control. It is the control. The enslaver thrives on doubt, and nothing provokes psychic distress more effectively than the erosion of certainty in one's own mind. It creates not just fear, but despair, a deep awareness that you are losing yourself while still being conscious of the loss. And it is in this moment, this exquisite nexus of awareness and helplessness, that the enslaver begins to feed. It siphons off the psychic resonance, savoring every tremor of terror, every shudder of confusion. Physical pain to it is crude and inefficient. Emotional agony, mental collapse, spiritual void, these are more potent by orders of magnitude. The more you resist, the more flavorful the torment. But even surrender is not mercy. It merely flattens the psychic waveform, allowing the enslaver to draw long, even gulps of your identity as it dissolves. Some might hope for unconsciousness, but this is denied. The enslaver is a master of keeping its prey awake, aware, during the process. It can suppress physical reactions, even pain reflexes, while amplifying mental distress to unbearable levels. Victims are often left motionless, staring blankly, their minds screaming inside a cage of silence. To those who observe, it seems like simple catatonia. But within, there is a storm of psychic agony, carefully sustained by an entity that understands every nuance of human mental architecture better than any interrogator or surgeon ever could. And the worst part? The enslaver adapts. It learns its victim. It tailors the experience. For some, it manifests as guilt, flooding the mind with illusions of past failures relived over and over with increasing clarity and self-hatred. For others, it exploits love, creating hallucinations of lost family members begging for help, only to be destroyed again and again while the victim watches, helpless. And sometimes it simply removes all stimuli, locking the consciousness in a void of utter sensory deprivation, where time ceases to function and thought becomes unbearable simply for its persistence. There is no reprieve. The enslaver has no deadline, no goal to complete, no mission to move on to. It exists in a realm without time, and it brings that timelessness into its torture. Days, weeks, months, these mean nothing. You are simply kept, processed, endured. To resist is pain. To yield is pain. There is no correct action. Every thought, every feeling, every moment is a resource to be harvested, twisted, and savored. There are records, hidden deep in the Black Library and the private vaults of the Inquisition, of psychers who were partially reclaimed after exposure to the enslavers. They do not speak. They do not scream. They simply weep, not for the pain, but for the memory of what they became. One described it through telepathic relay as being the ghost of your own mind watching your soul be eaten, one scream at a time. And yet the enslavers do not see themselves as cruel. That is perhaps the most horrifying revelation. They do not revel in suffering. They do not enjoy it. They do not even register it as anything other than environmental noise. Byproduct of their feeding. In their vision of the cosmos, sentience exists to be consumed. Emotion exists to be unraveled. Thought exists to be hollowed. The agony of the victim is as incidental to them as the cries of a cow might be to the butcher. This lack of malice, this indifference, is what makes their torture so absolute. You are not being tormented out of anger. You are not being punished. You are being used, efficiently, precisely, psychically, until there is nothing left of you but the outline of a memory, and even that will be devoured in time. The true annihilation that the enslavers bring is not done through fire or steel. It is performed in silence, within the deepest caverns of the mind, where identity is housed, that fragile, sacred construct of memory, feeling, and purpose. For the enslavers, this structure is not something to be respected. It is a framework to be dismantled. They do not merely dominate their victims, they disassemble them, piece by piece, memory by memory, until the concept of self becomes meaningless. To witness this process is to understand why some inquisitors choose to burn entire worlds touched by the enslavers. For when they consume a mind, they do not erase it outright. That would be too quick. Instead, they stretch the soul thin, forcing it to remain aware even as its contents are peeled away. Imagine knowing your name, and then one day it sounds wrong in your ears. Imagine recalling your mother's face, only to realize you no longer know the shape of a human mouth. The enslavers make strangers of us to ourselves. They begin subtly. The first things to go are often the most foundational: language, conceptual frameworks, emotional associations. A person may wake up one morning unable to understand the words they speak, or they may look upon their loved one and feel nothing, not even confusion, simply emptiness. The dissonance this causes is agony. One begins to question if they ever truly knew the person, or the words, or the world at all. The victim becomes their own betrayer, their own interrogator, their own accuser. And this unraveling is just the beginning. Once the scaffolding is removed, the enslaver burrows deeper into the personal. Birthdays, first kisses, the way the sun used to feel on childhood skin, the smell of a favorite food. These memories are not just taken. They are rewritten, mirrored, reversed, poisoned. A cherished moment might become a recurring nightmare, seen from the eyes of a stranger who mocks and twists it. The enslaver repurposes everything you are into psychic fuel, a tapestry of falsehood designed to provoke maximum dissonance. Eventually, the person stops trying to hold on. But even surrender is not peace. The enslaver ensures that the hollow vessel left behind remains aware, just enough to understand what has been lost. This is not amnesia. It is erasure with intent, a psychological scouring so complete that even instincts begin to fail. Breathing becomes a task. Walking requires thought. Speech becomes impossible, not because the throat cannot form words, but because the mind no longer understands what a word is. In some cases, the enslavers leave these husks alive. They are not merciful. The living serve as beacons, psychic lures for others to investigate. These hollowed beings act as relay points, drawing in rescue teams, fellow psychers, or even curious xenos. And when they come too close, the enslaver slips into them, continuing the cycle. These remnants, these psychic ruins, are not merely victims. They are weapons, traps baited with the echoes of identity. What makes this process so unbearable is not just the loss, but the awareness of that loss. The victim often knows something is wrong. They feel it slipping away. They grasp at their own vanishing thoughts like someone trying to catch mist with their hands. That desperate struggle, that flickering hope that something of them might survive, it is delicious to the enslaver. It makes the meal richer, more textured, more real. And while the Imperium tries to understand, to classify, to study, they never truly grasp the scale of the horror. The ecclesiarchy preaches that the soul is immortal. But what does that mean when your soul has been hollowed out like a carcass? What comfort is eternity if all that you are, all that made you you, has been chewed into meaningless tatters? Perhaps the most haunting truth is that some survivors, if they can be called that, retain a sliver of the original self. Just enough to watch the mockery of their own actions as they serve the enslaver. Their body moves, their voice speaks, but they are passengers, screaming in silence from the back seat of their own skull. And if, by some miracle, they are rescued, brought back into the light of the Imperium, they do not thank their saviors. They weep, because even freedom cannot restore what was lost, because even salvation feels like another form of captivity when there is no self left to rejoice. This is the breaking of identity. Not death, not madness, but a living, sustained undoing of being, a torment so intimate, so precise, that it eclipses all physical torture. This is what the enslavers bring, not pain, not fear, but the slow, surgical death of self. There are few torments in existence more perverse than having your own flesh betray you. Under the grip of the enslavers, this is not just metaphor, it is a daily, hourly, moment-to-moment violation. They do not merely puppet their victims. They make their victims watch as they are turned into living tools of invasion, desecrating everything they once held sacred with their own hands. Once the enslaver has threaded itself into a psyche, control over the body is a foregone conclusion. The nervous system becomes its marionette rig. The host's limbs twitch to unseen commands, their voice echoes alien words, their eyes take on that glazed, unnatural stare. But deep within, the original mind remains, gagged and paralyzed, experiencing every moment with unspeakable clarity. They are no longer a person. They are a stage, a biological machine being used to spread the infestation. And every action they perform under the enslavers will leave scars not on their body, but on their soul. The most horrific part of this torture is not that the victim is aware of the loss of autonomy. It is that they remain fully aware. They feel each movement as if it were their own. Their muscle memory obeys, even while their conscious will screams for it to stop. And it does not stop. It never stops. They might be forced to slaughter allies, to deceive comrades, to reach out and touch those they love, all with the calm expression of their own face while they rage helplessly inside. Every second of it brands the psyche deeper. Some accounts, taken in broken whispers from those few who have been freed, describe what it feels like as being buried alive inside your own skull. They hear the things they say under the enslaver's command. They feel the blood on their hands. They try to bite their tongues off, to throw themselves into fire, to scream warnings. And none of it works. The enslaver has perfect control. It allows just enough consciousness to survive that the suffering can ripen. It is not satisfied with physical manipulation. It wants the psychological aftermath. Worse still, the enslavers use the host's own memories to optimize their manipulation. They draw upon the host's knowledge of tactics, of relationships, of weaknesses, and weaponize it. A mother hollowed out by an enslaver might return to her family speaking with warmth and familiarity, only to lure them into psychic traps. A general might deliver coded orders to his troops that lead them into warp rifts. Every detail of the host's former life is dissected and turned against others. The victim knows what's happening, they understand it, and they can do nothing but endure. This is the level of cruelty the enslavers achieve. They force victims to become the architects of their own damnation. Every step the body takes furthers the goals of the invader. Every word spoken under its influence pushes others toward the same fate. And when the host is no longer useful, the enslaver doesn't necessarily discard them. Sometimes it leaves, suddenly allowing the broken husk of a person to reawaken with full memory of what they've done. The agony does not end with possession. It begins anew with freedom. Many of these ex-hosts are immediately executed by the Imperium for reasons of security. But others are interrogated, dissected, studied. Not to understand the enslavers, for true understanding is impossible, but to learn how they move, how they spread. These poor souls are never the same. They speak in broken metaphors. They do not refer to their own bodies in the first person. One man described his arms as traitors and refused to use them again. Another wept constantly, saying only, "I heard myself laugh while I cut them. I heard it. It was my laugh." It is in this context that we begin to grasp the true nature of the enslaver's torture. It is not just about inflicting pain. It is about corrupting the very framework of existence. The body, once a home, a trusted ally, becomes a prison and an accomplice. The victim no longer trusts their senses, their movements, even their thoughts. It is psychological erosion on every level, and it spreads. Perhaps worst of all, those who witness someone under enslaver control often hesitate. They recognize the face, the voice, the gait. There is that moment of doubt. Could they be saved? Could they be reasoned with? And that moment is fatal. The enslaver uses it to strike. In that way, even the recognition of the victim becomes a weapon. Their image, their familiarity, becomes a delivery system for new suffering. This is how the enslavers move through reality. Not as conquerors, not as overt destroyers, but as insidious corruptors, turning flesh into tools and souls into screams. They do not just steal your body. They force you to watch it betray everything you once were. With your eyes, with your voice, with your smile. Imagine the unthinkable. Your mind remains intact, untouched in its clarity, while your body, your voice, your actions all serve a will that is not your own. Now stretch that moment across days, weeks, even years, and make every second hurt. This is the essence of one of the enslaver's most horrifying tortures, the maintenance of full consciousness while stripping away all control. The result is not a quick death. It is a drawn-out imprisonment in your own body, where your only companions are horror, guilt, and the relentless echo of your helplessness. The enslavers understand human neurology with terrifying intimacy. They know precisely how much of the mind to suppress to prevent rebellion, and how much to leave active to ensure that suffering continues. They do not shut you down. They do not erase your awareness. They preserve it, carefully, obsessively, like a trophy kept behind glass. Your consciousness becomes a museum of agony, curated moment by moment by an intelligence that does not sleep, does not tire, and does not feel. You see everything. You hear your own words twisted into blasphemies. You watch your hands perform acts of betrayal and murder. You feel the warmth of blood that isn't yours, and you cannot scream, not outwardly. The scream stays locked in the prison of your mind, bouncing against the walls of your awareness until even your internal voice begins to fray. Some have described it as being buried under ice. Others as trapped in the reflection of a mirror that doesn't move when you do. The enslavers exploit this state mercilessly. They use it to deepen the torment. Sometimes they allow the host a sliver of control, just enough to beg for death or warn a loved one before snapping it away. This cruel tease magnifies the agony, creating false hope and then dashing it against the rocks of futility. It is not a mistake. It is a calculated element of their design, a reminder that resistance is a farce. And yet, even in such total domination, the enslavers are not content with silence. They use the victim's awareness as a conduit for further psychic attacks. The host becomes a listening post, hearing psychic signals, soaking up pain, confusion, fear from nearby minds. This flood of emotion surges through the victim's brain like a tidal wave, blending with their own despair until the boundary between me and not me dissolves entirely. They are no longer just suffering their own torment. They are made to feel the agony of others over and over as if it were their own. This tactic is especially effective against psychers, who are already sensitive to the ebb and flow of the warp. A psycher under enslaver influence becomes an amplifier of pain. Not only do they endure their own internal horror, but they are forced to absorb the echoes of every soul the enslaver reaches through them. It is a constant, psychic cacophony, a chorus of torment that can break even the most resilient minds. And still, the enslavers keep the host alive. They regulate vital functions with uncanny precision, ensuring that organs continue to function, that blood continues to flow. They can override pain receptors if necessary, only to re-engage them at the worst possible moment. Hunger and thirst are removed. Sleep is denied. The body continues, but the self is kept right at the edge, awake, aware, and suffering. Forever. Some hosts are even made to perform roles: commanders in battle, governors of cities, diplomats, all while their true self screams silently inside. The enslavers use these positions of influence to sow discord, orchestrate calamity, and invite more of their kind into the material world. And every time the host tries to resist, tries to force even a single muscle to disobey, they are punished. Not with pain, but with the awareness that their effort was meaningless, that they no longer matter. One surviving victim rescued during an Ordo Xenos operation described the experience in a psychic burst of raw thought. I was the mask. I wore my own skin while something else smiled with it. He took his own life days later, carving the words, "I saw me die," into the walls of his cell before opening his veins. This is not simply torture. It is unmaking with intent. The enslavers do not kill the mind. They preserve it in amber, conscious, unbroken, and drowning. And as long as the victim remains aware, the enslaver feeds, not on the body, not even on the thoughts, but on the persistent, echoing agony of a soul that cannot stop being. In the cold void between stars and the haunted tides of the warp, there is no greater prison than your own mind. And no warden more cruel than one who finds joy not in breaking you, but in making sure you watch yourself be broken. To most species, the senses are gifts, the ways through which life is experienced, love is felt, beauty is known. But to the enslavers, senses are doorways, vulnerabilities, threads to unravel sanity. They use them not to communicate, but to torment. Their mastery over the mind allows them to override and reprogram sensory input with such precision that reality itself becomes a weapon. The result is a form of torture so profound, so alien that it shatters not just the body or the mind, but the very concept of truth. Imagine seeing colors that do not exist in any spectrum, shapes that violate the laws of geometry, objects that move in defiance of physics not because they are real, but because your mind is being forced to perceive them as such. This is the foundation of the enslaver's sensory assault. They do not project illusions. That would be too simple. Instead, they rewire the way perception itself functions. Your eyes see what they command. Your ears hear what they design. Your skin feels what they desire. And it never stops. At first, the changes are subtle, a voice that seems to echo in a room with no walls, a shadow that flickers when there is no light, a whisper that seems to come from inside your skull. But soon the illusions accelerate, stacking upon one another, building into a kaleidoscope of impossibility. Victims report seeing people melt into smoke, hearing the laughter of dead friends, tasting rot in the air for days at a time. The senses cease to be tools. They become instruments of terror. And the enslavers tailor each hallucination to their victim. To a faithful imperial priest, they might manifest as the emperor turning his back, or sacred hymns warped into blasphemies. To a guardsman, they might recreate the horrors of past battles with such accuracy that the mind relives trauma in real time, with no end. The enslaver does not need to invent fear. It merely amplifies what is already there, pulling it forward and stretching it to grotesque extremes. But this is only the beginning. As the sensory onslaught continues, it becomes clear that the mind is being intentionally overwhelmed. The goal is not to simply terrify. It is to saturate the brain with so much contradictory input that it ceases to function coherently. Victims lose the ability to tell what is real. They reach out to grasp a wall that isn't there and fall into illusions that feel as solid as steel. They scream at hallucinations that speak back. They burn themselves trying to escape fire that doesn't exist, or ignore real injuries because they believe their bodies are already gone. This constant state of dissonance fractures identity. If your senses can no longer be trusted, then how do you trust your thoughts? If your eyes deceive, what of your memories? What of your feelings? Every contradiction is a chisel chipping away at sanity, until the victim no longer knows if they are asleep or awake, alive or dead. The enslavers do not torment with crude sensations. They deconstruct the entire experiential framework of the self. There are whispers in the darkest libraries of the Inquisition that the enslavers can even force victims to remember false things, events that never occurred, traumas that never happened. These synthetic memories become indistinguishable from truth. A person might come to believe they betrayed their own family, murdered innocents, or committed acts so vile that the guilt alone drives them to madness. And when confronted with the fact that these memories are false, the mind rejects the correction. The false pain becomes real. The fake guilt becomes permanent. The victim clings to it, unable to let go, because their senses, their reality, insist on its truth. Worse still, some enslavers isolate a single sense and amplify it to obscene levels. The sense of hearing might become so acute that the victim hears their own blood flow, the creak of their bones, the movement of skin on muscle. Sight might become so intense that they see through walls, through flesh, through time. Or so they believe. Smell and taste become unbearable when every breath is a flood of decay, every morsel of food a burst of disease. Touch can become hypersensitive to the point where even air against skin feels like sandpaper flaying flesh. It is important to understand, none of this is real, and yet all of it is experienced. The enslavers create a realm of subjective suffering where objectivity is a myth. The victim is trapped in a cage crafted not of bars but of sensations, each one false, each one agonizing, and each one endlessly recursive. They scream, but often not because of pain. They scream because their world no longer obeys rules. And that, more than any lashing or burning, is the most perfect torture, the destruction of certainty. In the end, the victim does not beg for death. They beg for truth, for something, anything, to be real again. But under the enslaver's control, even death is uncertain. It may come, it may not. It may happen 1,000 times a day and still be an illusion. The senses, once windows to the world, have become shackles, and reality, once a sanctuary, has become the deepest pit of all. Pain, in the hands of the enslavers, becomes something beyond human comprehension, not merely because of its intensity, but because of its alien precision. To suffer is to live in the shadow of death. To suffer under the enslavers is to be kept in that shadow forever, without the release that death might bring. Their mastery over psychic manipulation allows them to take what should be a finite experience, pain, and transform it into a living, self-sustaining torment that renews itself infinitely, each moment more unbearable than the last. Most creatures, even the cruelest of the galaxy, inflict pain as a side effect or as a tool. The enslavers sculpt it. They do not simply make you hurt. They redefine what pain means, tailoring it to the mind, the soul, and the individual flaws of each victim. They use pain not to break resistance, but to breed it, only to break it again and again in a repeating cycle. You cannot simply grow numb. You cannot adapt. They make sure of that. They start by suppressing the body's natural responses to agony. Shock, unconsciousness, numbing. These are removed. You feel everything, and not just in the present. The enslavers have the ability to make pain echo backward and forward through memory. A wound inflicted does not remain isolated. You relive it. You re-experience it. Each instance is warped just slightly, enough to stay novel, enough to keep surprising the nervous system. It's not torture through repetition, but through evolution. The pain becomes worse over time, not because it is increasing, but because the brain cannot find any rhythm in it, no pattern to anticipate, no wall to build against it. They alter perception so that suffering is disassociated from causality. A victim might feel as though they are burning, only to look down and see no flames. They might hear their own bones breaking without moving a muscle. The agony is real. The body responds, nerves fire, adrenaline floods, but there is no visible source. It is the mind tricked into betraying itself, generating the full sensory profile of agony on command. And yet there is more than physical torment. The enslavers corrupt the very meaning of pain. For a human, pain is a signal, a warning, a message. It tells you to stop, to flee, to react. But under the enslavers, pain loses its purpose. It becomes a presence, like gravity or time, not something that happens, but something that is. You don't just feel pain, you exist in it, like drowning in air. And the more you try to comprehend it, the deeper the torment becomes. Because understanding is impossible. They twist the brain's own neurotransmitters. Endorphins that should ease suffering are hijacked and repurposed. Sometimes they make the victim enjoy the pain, creating a perverse confusion where pleasure and agony intertwine. But it is never true pleasure. It is a mockery, a flickering high that always ends in a new, deeper low. Other times they simply remove the possibility of relief altogether. The pain plateaus, but the suffering intensifies because the brain expects an end that never comes. Even screaming becomes futile because the mind recognizes that it is not being heard, not even by itself. The enslavers use pain to isolate, to disconnect, to break trust in reality, in memory, in body. You begin to question if the agony is happening at all, or if it has always been this way. The victim spirals into solipsism, wondering if they were ever free, or if this torment is the only truth. This psychological fragmentation ensures that no amount of resilience can protect you. Strength of will becomes another tool the enslavers use. They let you build yourself back up just to tear you down again, each reconstruction more fragile than the last. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of their cruelty is how they observe suffering. Coldly. Clinically. They are not sadistic in the way demons are. They do not laugh or gloat. They study. They analyze. They learn. Each victim is a new experiment in endurance. The enslavers adjust variables, fine-tune stimuli, record psychic resonances like data. Your pain is not a show. It is a harvest, a yield. You are a crop, and your agony is the fruit. It is whispered that in the deepest vaults of the black ships, some of the most dangerous psychers ever recovered were found in states of silent torment, their minds still alive, their bodies still reacting to invisible wounds long after the enslaver had moved on. These psychers described in final moments of lucidity a sensation of being sculpted by the pain, like their souls had been reshaped into something else, something ready. Ready for what, they never said. And even if the enslaver is driven away, even if the victim is reclaimed, the pain remains. Not as memory. That would be mercy. It remains as a presence. A phantom sensation with no cause. Survivors live with the echoes forever. They twitch at nothing. They wake up screaming with no wounds. Some even begin to crave the return of their tormentor. Not because they want more pain, but because the absence of it has become the deeper horror. The silence is unfamiliar, empty, dead. Pain is no longer a reaction, it is a condition, a state of being, and under the enslavers, it becomes eternal. In the twisted depths of the enslaver's cruelty, there exists a torment so insidious that it does not rely on flesh, blood, or even fear, but on empathy. It is the forced psychic communion of minds, an enforced merging of souls, where the boundaries between self and others are not just blurred, but violently dissolved. Victims are made to experience not only their own agony, but the emotional and physical torment of countless others simultaneously. A bombardment of consciousness so intense that identity is drowned in the tide. This is not telepathy in any traditional sense. It is not the exchange of thoughts or the reading of minds. The enslavers rip down the walls that separate one mind from another, pouring thousands of voices, feelings, and experiences into a single vessel until the psyche cannot distinguish between what is me and what is them. It is like being caught in a hurricane of suffering. Not just as a witness, but as a participant in every death, every betrayal, every last breath of hope extinguished. To suffer is to be human, but to suffer as many, all at once, with perfect emotional fidelity, is to be something else entirely. Something unrecognizable, something shattered. Imagine feeling your own pain, and at the same time knowing exactly how it feels to be burned alive in another body, to suffocate in a collapsing building, to drown, to be torn apart by warp spawn. Not as metaphors or illusions, but as lived experiences. Every wound bleeds through your mind as if it were your own. Every scream echoes inside your head in voices you do not know, but now are. The enslavers ensure this agony is never random. It is orchestrated, tailored. They select the most agonizing memories and traumas from those in their psychic network. Children watching parents die, warriors abandoned by comrades, lovers betrayed, and project them into a new host with such intensity that the emotional resonance becomes indistinguishable from truth. You feel it, you believe it, it becomes part of you. Even if the event never happened to your body, your mind accepts it, and it scars you just the same. Over time, the victim begins to fracture. They start to speak in voices not their own. They recall events they never lived. Their personality is overwritten by countless fragments of the broken and the dying. One moment, they mourn a lost child they never had. The next, they scream battle cries from a war they never fought. Identity is no longer linear. It is a shattered mosaic of other people's lives, glued together with pain. And each new fragment added pushes the original self deeper into oblivion. In some especially perverse instances, the enslavers blend conflicting emotions into a single psychic moment. Rage and joy, love and disgust, pride and shame, creating a cognitive dissonance so intense it induces madness. The victim cannot resolve the contradictions. They feel as though they are being torn apart not by violence, but by impossible feelings that do not belong to them yet now define them. This internal war never ends, because new emotions are constantly introduced, each one incompatible with the last. What makes this torment even more devastating is the loss of personal suffering. The individual can no longer lay claim to their own pain. It has been diluted, swallowed by the pain of others. They can no longer say, "This is happening to me." All pain becomes universal, and in that universality, the self ceases to matter. When everything hurts and everyone hurts, your own hurt no longer has meaning. It is a devastating erasure, not just of self, but of purpose. This process also isolates the victim from any remaining hope of rescue. Loved ones may try to reach them, but the victim no longer recognizes those connections as real. They feel as though they have lived 1,000 lives, suffered 1,000 deaths. The idea of being just one person in one place with one story seems like a lie, a trick of the enslaver to make them vulnerable again. They recoil from touch, from voices, from comfort. Empathy becomes a weapon turned inward. Even the strongest psychers struggle to survive this kind of torment. Their ability to channel and control mental energy becomes a curse, because it allows them to retain more of the inflicted emotions, to understand them, to carry them. In the archives of the Ordo Xenos, there are records of sanctioned psychers who begged for lobotomization after enslaver exposure, not to escape physical control, but to silence the thousands of voices screaming inside them long after the entity was gone. In the final stages, some victims lose all traces of individuality. They refer to themselves as we. They do not respond to their names. They float in a fugue state, reciting the last words of strangers, mourning losses that were never theirs. The mind, having absorbed so much suffering, chooses to dissolve rather than continue. And in doing so, it becomes a beacon, a transmitter for the enslavers to project more torment into the material world, a psychic node that pollutes every thought nearby. This is not possession. This is communion, a dark, enforced unity of pain and consciousness where the self is shredded, not by violence, but by too much empathy. The enslavers do not just make you suffer. They make you everyone who has ever suffered. And then they make you watch as that suffering becomes all that is left of you. Hope, in the grasp of the enslavers, becomes the most exquisite form of torment. They do not simply extinguish it. That would be crude. Instead, they cultivate it, carefully, strategically, only to rip it away at the moment of deepest yearning. It is a cycle they repeat endlessly, not out of sadism, but because emotionally resonant suffering is their sustenance. A soul hovering on the edge of salvation, only to be plunged back into despair, generates a frequency of psychic agony more refined and nourishing than any mere physical pain could provide. The process begins with darkness, isolation, despair so absolute that the victim cannot imagine anything but the cold void of oblivion. It is in this state that the enslaver begins to inject the first flickers of hope, not externally but from within the victim's own mind. They allow memories to return. Faces of loved ones, the scent of home, a dream perhaps, of escape. These glimpses are not illusions. They are drawn directly from the victim's deepest desires and most sacred truths. And because they come from within, they feel real. The hope grows. The victim senses that perhaps they are breaking through the torment, that the presence of the enslaver is waning, that they are regaining control inch by agonizing inch. They might even hear friendly voices, comrades calling out, a savior approaching, the low hum of a ship's engine preparing to evacuate. Tears of relief flow, muscles tense in readiness. The spirit, cracked and bleeding, begins to rise. And then, the fall. With cold precision, the enslaver yanks it all away. The voice turns mocking. The ship burns before their eyes. The comrades fall into ash. It was never real. It was allowed to be believed just long enough to become salvation. And then it becomes a joke, a lie, a razor sharpened with trust. The pain of the fall is indescribable. Not just emotional pain, but a psychic tear, a rending of the soul where hope once resided. That gap becomes the new wound, and from it, the enslaver drinks. But they do not stop at one cycle. They repeat it, again and again. Each time, the hope takes a different form. A small act of kindness from another prisoner. A moment where control over the body seems to return. A voice in the darkness promising revenge, or justice, or freedom. And every time, the pattern repeats. The victim begins to expect betrayal, and yet they cannot stop hoping. That is the brilliance of the trap. Even the most broken soul yearns for light, and the enslavers know exactly how to stoke that flame without letting it become strong enough to burn them. Over time, the victim loses the ability to distinguish real from false. Even if genuine rescue arrives, even if a hand reaches out in truth, They hesitate, they pull away, they doubt, because every other time it was part of the torture. This cultivated hopelessness becomes self-sustaining. The victim sabotages their own salvation, choosing the familiar pain over the possibility of yet another devastating fall. In this way, the enslavers do not just break the will, they teach the victim to break it themselves. The most tragic examples of this torment come from those who were eventually rescued. Psychers, agents, civilians, all brought back from the edge, only to live the rest of their days waiting for the next betrayal. They become paranoid, withdrawn, emotionally numb, not because they fear pain, but because they fear hope. One survivor wrote before his suicide, "Every time I smile, I hear it laughing. Every time I trust, I feel it watching. I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of wanting to live." The enslavers also use this tactic on groups, not just individuals. In planetary invasions, they might allow small cells of resistance to form, manipulating them with false victories, staged breakthroughs, and carefully planted dreams. These groups become beacons of hope for others, symbols of resistance. And then, at the precise moment of climax, the enslavers reveal the truth. It was all a game. The victories were orchestrated, the leaders were controlled. The hope was allowed to grow so that its collapse would be felt by millions simultaneously. This kind of mass emotional devastation creates psychic shockwaves through the warp, powerful enough to open new rifts, summon other entities, or simply fuel the enslavers for another generation of torment. The process is efficient, sustainable, and devastating. No weapon in the galaxy, not virus bombs, not exterminators, not demon hosts, compares to the psychic implosion of a civilization that realizes its salvation was never real. And for the enslavers, it is not personal. They do not hate, they do not rejoice, they feed. They nurture pain like farmers grow crops. Hope is the water. Despair is the harvest. The cycle is eternal. In the end, the victim ceases to hope, not because they are strong, but because they are empty. They speak flatly. They move without urgency. They do not react to promises, threats, or kindness. Inside, they are hollowed, not because they suffered too much, but because they believed too many times that the suffering might end. The enslavers do not fear resistance. They do not fear strength. What they fear is meaning, connection, joy. And so they cut those things at the root, with hope, the sweetest lie, turned into the deepest wound. There is a cruelty that transcends the individual, one that stretches across decades, bloodlines, and civilizations. The enslavers understand this cruelty well. They do not always seek quick conquest or immediate consumption. Sometimes their most devastating torture is patience. They bind not just minds, but futures. They create chains that are inherited, passed from parent to child like a cursed legacy, until suffering becomes tradition and freedom becomes myth. When an enslaver establishes a stable psychic foothold, it can anchor itself to an entire population through a carefully maintained web of domination. The first generation may remember what life was like before. They remember choice, autonomy, hope, and it is precisely this memory that makes their suffering so rich. They are forced to live out their lives under control, knowing exactly what has been taken from them, knowing that their children will never know the difference. That knowledge alone is a form of torture more profound than any physical wound. Children born under enslaver influence are subtly shaped from the moment of consciousness. Their thoughts are guided, their emotions are dampened or exaggerated as needed. They grow up believing that the whisper in their mind is normal, that the pressure behind their thoughts is simply how existence feels. They are taught obedience not through punishment, but through psychic reinforcement. Pleasure is associated with compliance, discomfort with defiance. By the time they are grown, the idea of resistance feels unnatural, even painful. This is where the true horror of generational enslavement reveals itself. The second generation does not scream. They do not fight. They do not even dream of escape. They enforce the system themselves, becoming overseers, priests, leaders, and caretakers of a psychic prison they do not recognize as such. The enslavers no longer need to exert constant control. The culture itself becomes the cage. Tradition, ritual, belief, all subtly warped to maintain submission. For the first generation, this is agony. Parents watch their children grow into willing servants of the thing that destroyed their lives. They try to warn them, to explain, but the enslaver suppresses those conversations, twists their words, makes them sound mad or cruel. The parents are isolated, painted as broken relics of a dangerous past. Eventually, many stop speaking altogether. Their silence becomes another brick in the prison wall. As generations pass, the enslavers refine their control. Entire languages shift, subtly altered to remove concepts of freedom, rebellion, or individuality. Art becomes sterile, repetitive, emotionally shallow. History is rewritten, or simply erased. The past before the enslavers fades into legend, then superstition, then nothing at all. A world can exist for centuries in this state, functioning, productive, orderly, and utterly damned. The torture here is not constant screaming pain, it is existential suffocation. It is the slow realization, for the rare few who begin to awaken, that their entire species has been living a lie. These awakenings are often triggered by genetic anomalies, psychic mutations, or exposure to outside forces like the Imperium. When it happens, the individual is overwhelmed not just by the enslaver's wrath, but by the weight of generations lost. They feel the grief of ancestors they never met, the stolen potential of billions of unborn futures. The enslavers are ruthless in dealing with such anomalies. Sometimes they crush them immediately, flooding the mind with pain until it collapses. Other times, they do something far worse. They allow the awakened individual to see the truth in full clarity, to understand exactly what has been done to their people, and then they force them to live among the enslaved, unable to convince anyone, unable to change anything. This lone awareness becomes its own form of hell, a living monument to futility. In some rare and tragic cases, entire civilizations are discovered by the Imperium in this state. Worlds that appear compliant, peaceful, even prosperous. And then, under scrutiny, the truth emerges. The psychic resonance, the uniformity of thought, the absence of true individuality. These worlds are often condemned without hesitation. Exterminatus is declared not out of cruelty, but mercy. Because there is no saving a people who have forgotten what it means to be free. This is the enslaver's long game, not conquest but cultivation, not annihilation but ownership. They do not just break minds, they breed submission, they turn suffering into inheritance. And in doing so, they create a form of torture that outlives any single victim, a living system of despair that perpetuates itself long after the original screams have faded into dust. To be tortured for a lifetime is horror. To be tortured across generations, to know that your children and your children's children will be born into chains you cannot break, that is something far worse. That is the enslaver's true masterpiece. Love is the most sacred and powerful bond the human soul can experience. It inspires sacrifice, courage, resilience. And it is precisely this purity that makes it the most valuable weapon in the hands of an enslaver. Where hatred and fear can be manipulated through brute psychic force, love must be corrupted with finesse. The enslavers do not simply sever emotional ties, they twist them into blades, forcing victims to harm the very people they cherish most, turning affection into agony and connection into a curse. Once inside a mind, the enslaver identifies emotional attachments with frightening speed. It does not need complex interrogation or data. The emotions radiate like beacons, memories of holding a child, of a whispered promise between lovers, of the oath sworn between comrades. These feelings are strong, but also fragile, rooted in the deep architecture of the soul. The enslaver's reach is absolute, and it uses this knowledge not just to break, but to invert. The most common tactic is possession by proxy. The victim, still aware but unable to resist, is forced to act against someone they love. It might begin subtly, a lie, a betrayal of trust, a moment of coldness where warmth once lived. The victim watches in horror as they become a source of confusion and pain for someone who trusts them. The enslaver ensures that every word, every glance, every silence cuts deep. The torment is not in the act itself, but in the knowledge that love is being used as the knife. And then, the acts escalate. The victim may be made to lead a loved one into a trap, or to attack them physically. The enslaver times these actions perfectly, just when reconciliation seemed possible, just when hope flickered. Some are forced to kill those they love slowly and with precision, all while fully conscious, experiencing every sob, every plea, every ounce of trust dying in their beloved's eyes. The psychological devastation is total. Sometimes the enslaver goes further still. It might reverse the tactic, not forcing the victim to act, but making them watch as their loved ones are targeted through other enslaved hosts. The victim may be bound in their own body, screaming in silence while their partner or child is led into psychic corruption, unaware that salvation was inches away, but forever out of reach. This enforced helplessness breeds a self-hatred so profound it echoes across the warp. The enslavers feed on that despair, thick with betrayal and guilt. But the cruelest manipulation lies in how the enslaver preserves the memory of love. It does not allow it to fade. It keeps it fresh. Every detail of the relationship is replayed with perfect clarity. Every laugh, every kiss, every moment of shared vulnerability. This isn't nostalgia. It's weaponization. The victim is forced to relive what they had, what they lost, what they destroyed. Over and over, unable to forget, unable to move on. The love doesn't die. It festers. There are documented cases where entire families were turned into networks of psychic agony, one member enslaved and used to betray another. That betrayal used to bait a third. Eventually, the whole familial unit becomes a web of broken hearts and mutual destruction. The enslavers don't just annihilate the family, they hollow it, keep it standing in form but emptied of joy, connection, or meaning. Every interaction is a performance scripted by an alien will, every act of affection a trap, every reunion a prelude to loss. This kind of torture leaves marks deeper than any physical wound. Survivors who are somehow freed rarely speak of what they did. They isolate themselves, terrified of hurting someone again. Some even seek execution, begging the Inquisition for the Emperor's mercy. Others attempt to rekindle the bonds they destroyed, but the wounds never truly close. Trust becomes a haunted thing. Even joy feels like bait. The legacy of the enslaver lingers in every uncertain touch, every half-smile, every moment of silence that stretches too long. In more advanced forms of this torment, the enslavers manufacture new love, false connections created entirely within the mind of the victim. They might believe they have a child, a lover, a sibling who never truly existed. The love is real. The emotions, the memories, the bonds, all fabricated with such detail that they cannot be distinguished from truth. And then once that bond has matured, once the victim is fully invested, the enslaver erases it. Instantly, without explanation. The absence becomes a hole, a yawning emotional void that the victim cannot explain or fill. It is heartbreak weaponized beyond anything natural. Even among the daemons of chaos, this level of precision and cruelty is rare. They revel in carnage and madness. The enslavers, by contrast, sculpt their pain carefully. They understand that the greatest agony comes not from hatred, but from love turned inside out. Love, the one thing that gives life meaning, becomes the ultimate source of suffering. And when the victim finally breaks, when they can no longer bear to feel, the enslaver moves on, leaving behind a soul that can no longer connect, no longer trust, no longer hope. In the cold silence that follows, the victim doesn't scream. They whisper names, names of people they loved, names that once meant warmth, now burned into their minds as echoes of torment. The enslaver has taken everything, not just the flesh, not just the mind, but the heart. And what remains is not just a broken person, but a warning that in the hands of an enslaver, even love is a weapon. Survival, in the grip of the enslavers, becomes a curse. For most species, to endure suffering is to find meaning in it, to adapt, to learn, to harden. But the enslavers turn this very resilience into a new form of torment, a loop of adaptation and escalation in which survival becomes the mechanism of continued agony. The more you resist, the more intricate the suffering becomes. It is not strength that saves the victim, it is strength that dooms them to suffer longer, deeper, and more personally than anyone else. In the early stages of exposure, victims often try to fight back. Some draw on faith, on memory, on oaths and identities forged in war. Astartes, inquisitors, seasoned psychers, all attempt to erect barriers of thought, of discipline, of self. And for a moment it can seem like these mental bastions hold. The enslaver is slowed, puzzled perhaps. The victim feels a brief triumph, believing they have withstood the tide. But this illusion of defense is what the enslaver wants. It watches, it learns. It studies the contours of resistance like an artisan studying marble before the first strike of the chisel. Adaptation begins. The enslaver alters its approach, twisting its manipulations into shapes that bypass the specific strengths of the victim. For the Stoic, it implants dreams that are not nightmares, but memories, sweet, warm, and then subtly wrong. For the faithful, it mimics divine voices with near-perfect accuracy, issuing commands in the name of gods they love. For the logical, it introduces paradoxes so subtle they unravel sanity one syllable at a time. Every tactic is a scalpel aimed precisely where the soul is weakest. Those who survive the first assaults begin to change. They compartmentalize. They try to function. They learn what triggers the worst pain and avoid it. They find rituals, counting, reciting litanies, focusing on abstract geometry, anything to anchor the mind. But the enslaver allows this. It lets the victim settle into patterns just long enough to feel that they've adapted, that the suffering has plateaued, that maybe, just maybe, they can endure. Then, it changes the game. Suddenly, the rituals don't work. The voice shifts. The dreams become layered, recursive, feeding off themselves like a maze that rearranges each time you turn a corner. What once provided stability now brings madness. This cycle repeats, hope through adaptation, followed by new torture tailored to that adaptation. The victim becomes a mouse in a labyrinth that rewrites itself every time the mouse finds a path. And the enslaver watches, always watching, not out of malice, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under pressure. Over time, the victim stops seeking escape. They begin to seek meaning in the suffering. This is the most dangerous adaptation. The enslaver detects this spiritual shift and exploits it mercilessly. It begins to craft pain with symbolism. The victim believes their suffering has purpose, that by enduring it, they are shielding others, earning redemption, passing some cosmic test. The enslaver provides just enough validation to make these beliefs feel real. And then, when the victim fully believes in the redemptive power of their pain, it reveals the truth. There is no purpose, no shield, no salvation, no test. The suffering is meaningless. The endurance is useless. The pain has no end because it is not a path. It is the destination. This shattering revelation is like dying again, but slower. The victim, having built their identity around survival and meaning, finds both stripped away. And now they continue, not because they want to, but because they no longer know how to stop. The body adapts too. Pain thresholds increase, reflexes dull. Even the aging process seems to bend. Some victims live far longer than their species should allow, kept alive by the enslaver's will, not out of mercy, but to stretch the experiment. These long survivors become husks of adaptation, minds wired for endurance, souls calcified by loss, flesh puppeted just enough to maintain the cycle. They are no longer alive in any meaningful sense, but that the enslaver keeps them conscious just in case a new form of torment can be derived from their state. The few who escape, truly escape, are marked forever. They speak in riddles, they laugh at nothing, they refuse comfort, flee pleasure, avoid connection. One said, "Every time I healed, it learned a new wound. I became a map of pain, and it read me like scripture." These are not survivors in the traditional sense. They are ruins that still breathe, and they are feared by those who know the truth. Because endurance is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is a sign that the torment has become you. In the hands of the enslavers, adaptation is not victory. It is just the next level of suffering. Every survival tactic becomes a doorway to a new kind of pain. Every act of willpower is another page in the enslaver's book. They do not seek to destroy you in one blow. They seek to remake you, again and again, until the only thing left is a mind that endures not because it is strong, but because it has forgotten how to stop suffering. That is the final irony. The enslaver teaches the soul to survive, and in doing so ensures it will never be free. There is a mercy in death, a finality, a silence, a release. Even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, death is often the only escape from torment. But the enslavers do not allow such luxury. They deny oblivion with surgical cruelty, extending consciousness beyond all natural limits, keeping their victims alive and aware long after the body should have failed, long after the mind should have dissolved. In their grasp, even death becomes just another illusion, one more hope to be twisted and shattered. When a victim reaches the brink, when organs fail, when neural activity slows, when breath ceases, the enslaver intervenes. Not through healing, but through manipulation. It reanimates what should be dead, not in the grotesque way of necromancy or demonic possession, but with quiet, efficient psychic control. It stimulates nerves, it floods cells with energy, it binds the soul to the body with threads of pure warp matter. The heart beats again, but not for the victim. The lungs draw air, but not by will. They have become a machine, a host kept running for one purpose, to continue suffering. This is not life. It is suspension, a state between being and non-being, where time loses meaning and thought becomes a prison of unbroken clarity. The victim feels their decay. They are aware of every inch of rot, every collapsing cell. They feel hunger but never starve. They feel thirst but never die of it. The enslaver modulates every function with precision, ensuring maximum degradation without complete failure. They become relics, conscious ruins held together by torment. And worse, they know they should be dead. They remember the moment of death, the final breath, the slipping heartbeat, the flash of darkness. They felt it, they accepted it, and then they woke again. It is a betrayal deeper than any inflicted by another person. Nature itself betrayed them. The promised end did not come. The enslaver robbed them of their right to die. There are reports, locked behind the highest clearance levels of the Ordo Xenos, of enslaver victims who survived for centuries in this state, found embedded in the walls of ancient derelict ships or fused into the soil of cursed worlds. Still breathing, still weeping, not speaking, not screaming, just silently enduring, their eyes wide with the eternal knowledge that nothing ever ends. These are not aberrations. They are by design. The enslavers keep these monuments alive as reminders, as warnings, as psychic beacons of fear. The torment does not stop with the body. The soul, too, is shackled. Most faiths, from the imperial creed to the beliefs of Xenos cultures, speak of the soul's release upon death, of reunification with the divine, or return to the warp or the silence of the void. But the enslavers anchor the soul to the corpse, binding it with warp filaments, trapping it in the echoing halls of a dying mind. This is more than undeath. This is anti-death. The inversion of the natural order, where the soul is denied its destination and instead becomes a ghost in a decaying shell. Some psychers believe this is how enslavers reproduce. Not biologically, but metaphysically. Each tormented soul kept alive against the current of existence becomes a seed for new warp resonance. The psychic agony radiates into the immaterium, forming a kind of echo chamber that calls to others of their kind. In this theory, the enslaver does not merely consume, it cultivates. Each victim becomes a haunted transmitter of pain, birthing new tormentors through the resonance of their own suffering. Even those who are eventually freed, through the intervention of inquisitorial strike teams or exterminatus, do not simply pass on. The trauma of being denied death echoes into the afterlife, assuming they even reach it. Astropaths have reported screams in the warp from souls freshly released from enslaver bonds. Screams not of relief but of confusion and terror. They are so scarred, so twisted, that the warp itself rejects them. Some disappear, others linger as broken shades, no longer human, no longer anything. This form of torment is especially horrifying to the Adeptus Mechanicus, who pride themselves on the interface between man and machine. To them, death is a moment of transcendence, a chance to return to the Omnissiah. But the enslavers twist that concept, turning the human-machine hybrid into a meat prison. Alive, but incapable of interface, of communion, of purpose. The machine god does not speak to the enslaved. They are neither organic nor synthetic. They are nothing. To the ecclesiarchy, this is a blasphemy beyond words. The emperor promises that through death, the faithful return to his light. The enslavers mock this promise. They hold souls in limbo, using the emperor's own faithful as lanterns of agony. Some believe this is why the Adeptus Sororitas burn so many bodies, not just to purify, but to ensure that no corpse remains vulnerable to such violation. The flame is mercy, not vengeance. In the end, the victim loses all sense of time. Centuries pass in silence. They do not age. They do not forget. They simply endure. And in that endurance, they become something else. Not alive, not dead, but an echo, a warning. Proof that in the galaxy of Warhammer even death can be defeated, and not as a miracle, but as the most perfect torture of all. There are monsters in the warp that tear reality asunder, that scream through the void with laughter and bloodlust. There are gods that devour souls for amusement, demons that burn planets for attention, and heretics who revel in suffering for suffering's sake. But the Enslavers are something else, something older, colder, and more terrifying. They do not hunger, they do not rage, they do not even hate. And that is why they are feared, not just by mortals, Puff, but by the very entities that haunt the immaterium. Even daemons whisper of them. Even chaos steps lightly around their presence. The warp is not a place of order. It is a sea of emotion, rage, lust, sorrow, ambition, a reflection of the living minds that feed it. The chaos gods are the most dominant predators within it, each carving out a realm sustained by their chosen emotion. They clash, they plot, they bleed meaning into an endless war for supremacy. But the Enslavers do not participate in this struggle. They do not claim territory. They do not offer gifts or forge pacts. They are outsiders, intrusions, incompatibilities within the emotional logic of the warp. And the warp hates what it cannot understand. To a daemon, the Enslaver is not competition. It is contamination. It does not burn like corn, seduce like Slanesh, fester like Nurgle, or manipulate like Tzeentch. It infects, it changes the rules of the game. It does not speak the language of gods and souls. It speaks the language of control. Absolute, indifferent, surgical. When an enslaver infiltrates a warp realm, it does not negotiate. It does not challenge. It simply begins to feed, draining emotion from the environment, unmaking the emotional resonance that sustains demonic entities. There are records hidden deep within the Black Library and whispered in the darkest circles of the Inquisition, of demonic manifestations that fled rather than face an enslaver. Warp storms that collapsed into silence. Realms of chaos that suddenly withered, their color bleeding into gray, their essence evaporating into null. The presence of an enslaver is like a black hole. Not a storm, but an absence. It devours meaning, identity, context. And in a place where meaning itself is matter, this is annihilation. Some scholars suggest that this is why the enslavers remain rare. Not because they are weak, but because even the warp reacts to them like a virus. Chaos, for all its madness, is a system. A constantly shifting, contradictory system, but a system nonetheless. The enslavers do not belong to it. They are outside its causality. They are not part of the mythos. They are not born of mortal emotion. They are born of something before emotion, a primeval hunger that predates gods. This alien nature means the demons cannot resist them effectively. A bloodthirster may shrug off blades and sorcery, but against an enslaver's psychic dominance, its mind becomes just another target. The rage that fuels it becomes a weakness, a frequency to be hijacked, to be mirrored, to be turned inward until the daemon consumes itself in recursive madness. There are reports, unconfirmed but consistent, of daemons driven insane simply by prolonged exposure to enslaver presence. Not destroyed, not banished, broken. And yet, for all their threat, the enslavers do not seek dominion over the warp. That is perhaps what makes them most terrifying. They are not conquerors. They do not crave thrones. They do not play the game. Their incursions into reality are incidental. They follow signals, infest psychers, and propagate through the psychic resonance of suffering. Their goals are not known, not even guessed. Some believe they are fleeing something worse. Others think they are probes, the first tendrils of a greater consciousness waiting beyond even the warp. A god not of emotion, but of pure parasitism. Even the Ordo Malleus, with all its power and knowledge, avoids engaging with enslavers directly. The few operations launched against them ended in disaster. Ships lost in silence. Astropaths driven mad by signals with no pattern. Entire strike teams found dead, with no signs of battle, their eyes wide and dry, their mouths locked open in a final, unvoiced scream. The Inquisition learned to burn worlds rather than risk containment. There is no bargain, no ritual, no daemon binding, only eradication. And still they come. Not in fleets, not in hordes, but in whispers, in dreams, in cracks in the veil. Every psyker is a potential doorway. Every scream is a pulse they might follow. Every soul in pain is a song they might hear. The galaxy teeters constantly on the edge of a silent invasion, one that does not begin with war, but with a single, unnoticed mind, unraveling under a pressure no one else can feel. That is why the enslavers are feared even by the warp itself, because they are not predators of flesh or spirit. They are predators of selfhood. They do not corrupt, they erase, and when they are done, Not even the memory of resistance remains, just silence, just stillness, just the echo of a scream that was never heard. If you are reading this, if you feel something behind your thoughts, a pressure, a pattern, a whisper, do not pray, do not fight, do not hope. You are already too late. And if you still remember what it felt like to be yourself, treasure it, because the enslaver feeds best when you still think you exist. If you've made it this far through this journey into the unspeakable depths of the enslaver's torment, then you understand something most never will. That in the vast, violent theater of the Warhammer universe, some horrors don't come with claws, with fire, or chains. Some horrors whisper. Some horrors peel back the soul with elegance, not brutality. And some, like the Enslavers, are so utterly alien, so fundamentally incompatible with our understanding of suffering that the mind almost wants to forget them. But we mustn't forget, because forgetting is how they win. We've seen how the Enslavers twist the mind and mutate the meaning of pain, how they use your own body as a weapon and trap you within it. We've explored how they devour hope by cultivating it, how they twist love into torment, and how they transform adaptation into just another instrument of suffering. They deny death, deny meaning, and stretch agony across generations, not in blood, but in the very architecture of thought and memory. And they do all of this without hate, without wrath. They simply are. And that's why they're so feared, not just by the Imperium, not just by psychers, but by daemons, by the warp itself. These are not invaders. They are a reality cancer, a nullification event with a will. Where they move, the warp recoils. Where they feed, emotion withers. Even the Chaos Gods, primal beings of passion and excess, sense in them a truth too terrible to face, that nothing they are, nothing they feed on, nothing they mean is permanent. The Enslavers are entropy wearing the face of control. In a galaxy of superweapons and star-consuming horrors, it is easy to overlook the quiet, creeping enemy. But the Enslavers don't need fleets. They need a whisper, a crack in a mind, a single moment of psychic vulnerability, and from that moment an entire world can fall. Not with fire, not with blood, but with silence, as minds disappear behind dead eyes, as lovers betray each other with calm precision, as children forget what it means to dream. We tell ourselves stories about chaos to keep fear manageable. We imagine daemons as enemies to be fought, gods to be defied, monsters to be slain. But the Enslavers don't care about our stories. They don't care about our wars. They are not part of the great myth. They are something else, a different kind of truth. One where pain never ends, where the soul is not precious, where even the idea of being you can be devoured. So if you ever feel something in the dark of your thoughts, something shaping the edges of your dreams, do not wait for signs. There won't be any. Do not look for symptoms. You won't recognize them. You'll just stop being you, and you won't even know it happened. That is the final horror of the Enslavers. Not that they torture, but that when they are done, you thank them for it. Because you no longer remember why you wouldn't. If this journey into the deepest, coldest cruelty of the Enslavers has chilled your soul, if you now see just how far torment can go when it sheds all theatrics, then subscribe to the channel. We'll keep bringing you deeper into the dark corners of Warhammer lore where few dare to look. Because in this universe, knowing the enemy is the only armor you might ever get. And when the next horror comes, when it whispers in your mind, you'll remember what we said here. You'll know its name. Enslaver.